Okay, so this is one of those other random lessons that we have to cover. This one's really hard to show you like plenty of examples. So this video is pretty much just going over the different types that you could see. And hopefully it's pretty basic, so we'll go over it. When we're talking about transformations, we're talking about the physical transformations, whether on a graph, which means does it stretch, does it compress, does it get does it reflect, does it not, those kinds of things. So we'll first go over the three basics. All right, this is when we're talking about what we've seen in graphs already. Okay, so this is kind of stuff we've seen already, and then we'll go over into the tougher stuff, I guess. So when we're talking about the Y-intercept, we never talked about what it actually meant. So we call the Y-intercept a vertical shift. Okay, vertical meaning up and down, and shift meaning moving up and down. So the bigger the Y-intercept is, the higher it is positive-wise, that means it increases, which means it gets shifted upward, okay? If I go the opposite direction and this decreases, which means more to the negative side, that means it gets shifted downward, all right? So I'm just going to show you a basic example on my graph. So let's say I do y equals x is the basic. Okay, notice when I graph it, it's a simple, goes through the origin, blue line, nice and pretty, okay? If I were to put a y-intercept of x plus 5, I want you to notice how they're parallel, they're the same line, but it got shifted upward because of that positive 5. If I were to do it on the opposite end, if I were to do minus 5, okay, again, it's the same line, but it got shifted downward. So that's what it means by that vertical shift. If we talk about reflection, okay, this is the negative versus the positive side of it, okay, where the negative slope versus the positive slope, that is what we call the reflection across the y-axis, okay? So it's easier to just show you on my calculator what that could look like. So y equals x is just positive. Okay, so it's the same blue line. But if I were to change it to negative x, what happens with that is a reflection. It's no longer going positive direction, it's reflecting across the y-axis, which means it's going the negative direction. And that's what you get is a reflection. The steepness is referring to how steep it is. So steep, it's pretty basic. So when I refer to steepness, that's referring to the slope, okay? The bigger the slope, which means on the more positives, or the bigger the slope, that means it's more steep. And the smaller the slope, the less steep, or the flatter it is. So I'm going to show you some examples, okay? If I do x, we already know what that looks like. That's a simple y equals x. Let's say so y equals x is a slope of 1. So let's say we come up with a number that's bigger than 1. So let's say I come up with 4x. Let's predict what's going to happen. Since 4 is bigger than 1, that means it's going to increase. That means it's going to be steeper, which means more steep. And let's see. If I graph it, notice the steepness. Blue line, which is my y equals x, is flatter, and it would be a lot tougher to climb that red line. Well, that's what it means by steep, is it would be really, really tough to climb that one. You would really need some rock climbing gear. But let's say I go the opposite direction. Let's say I go smaller than 1. What I mean by smaller than 1 would be a decimal. So let's say I do 0.5x. So this is greater than 1 and this is less than 1. If you look at that black line, it's not as steep as the blue line, but it's flatter than the blue line. So that's what it means by less steep or flatter. It's just, that would be a lot easier to walk on. It's a little uphill, but it'd still be easier to walk on than the blue or the red line. So the slope is referring to the steepness. So we're going to take those same ideas, but this goes in more in depth, okay? So here's how I keep it all simple, because I know it can be really, really overwhelming, okay? Here's how I keep it simple. Anytime you see a change that's inside the parentheses, and you'll see what I mean here in a minute, I am referring to a change in the x, okay? And remember, x goes two different directions. It goes left to right, okay? Or horizontal. Think of it that way. But anytime I look at inside the parentheses, I have to remember the opposite of what I see, okay? And I'll show you that here in a second. Versus if I talk about outside the parentheses, outside the parentheses is referring to the y, and this is your vertical, this is your up and down, okay? And this is from up to down, obviously, but I take it at face value. So inside the parentheses is x, and I think opposite. Outside the parentheses, I think y, and I think face value. So no change, no opposite, nothing. Okay, so let me show you. If I look at this first example right here, notice the plus 0 is outside the parentheses, okay? Since it's outside the parentheses, that means I know I'm talking about the y. And the y goes up and down. So, just like we talked about just now, if it increases, okay, that means on the positive side, that means I'm going to go up. If it goes below 0 on the negative side, that means I'm going to go down. Pretty simple, right? But let's look at what happens if it's inside the parentheses. So if you look at this shift, this is called the horizontal shift. Notice how the plus 0 is inside the parentheses. Since it's inside the parentheses, I know it's talking about the x, okay? But here's the tricky part. I have to think the opposite. So if I see plus, it's actually going to go to the left. And if I see minus inside the parentheses, that means it's actually going to go to the right. It's the opposite of what I see. In my mind, I see plus 1 or plus 10, and I think, oh yeah, it's going to go to the right. But it's the opposite, it's going to go left. Just like if I see minus 2, in my mind, I think, oh yeah, it's going to go left, when in reality, it's going to go to the right. Okay, so to really understand this, I want to show you visually what that looks like, okay? So, especially when it comes to the opposite. So in my calculator, I wrote inside the parentheses, x minus 5. And in my mind, I think, oh, that means it's x, so that means it's going to go left 5. But if I look at the graph, you are going to see, if I compare it to x, I'm going to write x there, and I put x minus 5, in my mind, I think, oh, this blue one is going to go to the left. It's going to move over to the left. But if you look at it, it actually got moved to the right. So that's what I mean by opposite. Even though it said minus 5, inside the parentheses means to the right 5, okay? So let me show you. Notice the plus 7, how it's outside the parentheses. Since it's outside the parentheses, that means it's going to go for the y. And since it's positive 7, that means it's going to go up. Easy. If I look at the second one, it says minus 6.25 outside the parentheses. Outside the parentheses means y. And since it's negative or minus 6.25, that means down. Yay, easy. But when I look at inside the parentheses, I have to think the opposite. So inside the parentheses means x, left or right. Positive 9 inside the parentheses doesn't actually mean right 9, it means left 9. Just like here, if it says minus 7 halves, it doesn't mean left 7 halves, it means right 7 halves. So you have to think the opposite. Okay? Now, the same could go for a reflection. Think inside the parentheses is x, outside the parentheses is y. So, if I see this negative, do you see how it's in front, but it's outside the parentheses? Okay, outside the parentheses is, so this one, the negatives are the only thing that are different, okay? It is technically the opposite. So if I see that negative outside the parentheses, that means it's a reflection across the x-axis, okay? And then if I see it inside the parentheses, the negative x, that means it's going to reflect across the y-axis. So the reflections are a bit tricky, but let me explain them a little bit better than I just did. If I see the negative outside, that is the y, okay? But I have to think of this as opposite y, okay? So if I look at a graph, all right, the opposite of y, so let's say I have y is up here, okay? It's +4 or something like that. The opposite of that is -4, which is down here. Notice that it's a reflection across the x-axis. So it's like visually, it's just weird unless you look at it in the picture. Same thing if I do it inside the parentheses. This means opposite x, okay? So if I graph a point on the x-axis, let's say 3, and then I do the opposite of 3 is -3, this is a reflection across the y-axis. So that's where the reflection comes from. Okay, so what can be the trickiest is vertical stretch and horizontal stretch, or vertical compression or horizontal compression. So you're going to see me use a rubber band as a visual, okay? So same idea. Outside the parentheses is y, which is your vertical, and inside the parentheses is your x, okay? So if I have a number outside the parentheses, this is like +1. If it's bigger than 1, okay, and it's outside the parentheses, it's a stretch, like this, okay? So a stretch, which means it gets thinner, not wide. If it's less than 1, that means a decimal or a fraction that's less than 1, then it's what we call a vertical compress. So vertical stretch is greater than 1. A vertical compress is less than 1. And when I vertically compress, it gets wider going sideways. So thinner, wider. Vertical stretch, vertical compress, okay? When I look at the opposite of that, this is your horizontal stretch and compress. Okay, I look inside the parentheses. This is when they give me a number inside the parentheses. But remember, inside the parentheses, I have to think opposite. So horizontal means this direction, okay, left to right. If I see bigger than 1, in my mind, it should be a stretch. But since it's the opposite and it's bigger than 1 inside the parentheses, it's actually going to be a compress, okay? Or horizontal compress. So bigger than 1 is not a stretch, it's a compress. And just like if it was less than 1, normally that would be a compress, but it's actually a stretch, okay? So let me go over it again. Vertical stretch and compress, if it's bigger than 1, it's a stretch. If it's smaller than 1, it's a compress. This is vertical though. If it's horizontal and it's bigger than 1, it's a compress. And if it's less than 1, then it's a stretch, okay? So if I look at here, okay, notice the 5 is outside the parentheses. So outside the parentheses means y, that means up and down. Since it's bigger than 1, it's a vertical stretch, okay? If I look at 3/4 outside the parentheses, that's less than 1. That means it's gonna be a vertical compress, okay? Gonna squeeze down. If I look at the opposite of that, so look at 7, it's inside the parentheses, okay? That means horizontal, inside the parentheses. But 7 is bigger than 1. In my mind, I think, oh, that's stretch. But it's actually the opposite. It's compress, okay? And if I look at 1/2, since it's less than 1, in my mind, I think it's compress, but it's actually stretch, okay? So do it again. If vertically, outside the parentheses, if it's bigger than 1, stretch. Outside the parentheses, if it's less than 1, compress. Inside the parentheses, if it's bigger than 1, it's compress. Smaller than 1, stretch. Okay? Now we are going to mix them all together. Okay? So yes, the answers are already on here, but I want us to read it from left to right. We are going to identify what transformations are in the problem. So if I look at this first example, I see 2 transformations. I see this negative in front and this positive 4 outside. So notice, let's do the negative first. Negative outside the parentheses means negative y. Well, the opposite of y is a reflection across the x. Okay? Then I see this positive 4 outside the parentheses. Anytime I talk about outside, that means the y. And since it's positive 4, that means it's going to go up 4. Okay? So this is a reflection across the x because opposite y. And this is a vertical shift up 4. Okay? Because it's outside the parentheses, so up 4. If I look here, there's 2 transformations here. There's this negative and there's this minus 8. So negative inside the parentheses, negative x, means opposite x, which means reflection across the y. Outside the parentheses, minus 8, since it's outside the parentheses, that's the y, and since it's minus 8, that means it's going to get shifted down 8. So this is opposite x is a reflection across the y, and minus 8 is shifted down because it's outside the parentheses. Okay. Number 3, I see 2 transformations. I see 1/5 and I see positive 2 inside the parentheses. Okay. So outside the parentheses is the y. That means this direction. Okay. Since 1/5 is less than 1, that means it's a compress. It's a vertical compress. Now, positive 2 inside the parentheses. Inside the parentheses is the x, and that means left to right. But we have to remember the opposite. Since I see positive 2, my mind wants to say go to the right 2, but it's actually the opposite, and I'm actually going to go left 2. Now let's step it up. This one has 3 different transformations, okay? The first one is this negative outside the parentheses. So this to me says opposite y. The opposite of y is a reflection across the x. Then I see the 1/4 being multiplied and it's inside the parentheses. So I think of horizontal and I have to think the opposite. Since it's less than 1, I want to say it's a compress horizontal, but it is actually a stretch horizontal because it's less than 1. So it's a horizontal stretch. The last one is minus 1. Minus 1 inside the parentheses. Inside parentheses is the x. And minus 1, since I got to think the opposite, means normally it would be left 1, but it's actually right 1. Okay? Last one. This one has 1, 2, 3, 4 different transformations. And that's the most you can actually get. So if I look at the negative at the front, since it's negative y, because negative's outside, that means reflection across the x. Got it, opposite. Then I look at the 8. 8 is outside the parentheses, and it's being multiplied. That means it's one of these. And since it's outside the parentheses, that means the y, which is up and down. Since it's bigger than 1, it's a stretch. So bigger than 1 is a vertical stretch. Then inside the parentheses is this plus 2. Inside the parentheses is the x, but I have to think opposite. So in my mind, I want to say to the right 2, but it actually is to the left 2. And lastly, this minus 5 outside the parentheses. Minus 5 outside the parentheses is, since it's outside the parentheses, it's the y. And since I'm going up and down, or moving up and down, not stretching, since it's negative 5, that means I'm going to go down 5.